In this video, I'll be covering the last two sections of Chapter 12. First, we'll talk about business cycles, and then we'll talk about industry analysis. So we've moved from macroeconomic, countrywide, and we'll be moving down to industry level analysis here. First, let's start talking about business cycles. Okay, so what are business cycles? Business cycles are just recurring cycles of recession and recovery and expansion in an economy. And it's called a business cycle because sort of the economic activity in a country tends to cycle. It goes up and down, okay? And we're going to give names to the different phases in a cycle. And when everything is operating at its maximum and everything is going well, we call that the peak of the business cycle. That's transition from end of expansion to start of contraction. Contraction is shrinking of economic output. That's generally known as recession. And remember, recession was what? It was 2 quarters of shrinking GDP. So contraction is that recession or shrinking of economic output. Trough is when you're hitting the bottom, transition point between recession and recovery. And then expansion is when you're expanding out, the economy is growing. A good way to visualize this is on a picture like this, and it corresponds to the cycle. So at the peak, everything is operating, full blast. Then you might tend to fall into contraction. That's a recession. You hit the bottom, that's a trough. And then finally, it begins to turn around and expand, and that's our expansion phase. Okay. So one just simple idea in terms of investing is that, hey, if I can predict the business cycle, and if I can predict, for example, when a contraction is coming, then maybe I'd want to pull my money out of the stock market. And if I can predict when an expansion is coming, maybe that's a good time to put my money into the stock market. Okay, let's see if that idea actually works out. And let's talk about that. So it turns out there's a big area of economics that tries to predict sort of where the economy is going, where we are in the business cycle. Now that could be a whole class on its own. We're not going to dive too much into that. But if you look into that, you'll find something known as economic indicators. And some of these, the most important ones for us would be leading economic indicators. Those are the ones that are predictive of the future. Okay, so these are economic series that tend to rise and fall in advance of the rest of the economy. So the idea here would be, hey, if I watch those leading economic indicators, maybe they will predict for me whether the economy is going to do well or poorly, and then I'm going to use that to time my investments. Okay, so let's see what some of those are. And I'm going to shoot this down pretty quickly, this idea, because one of the best leading economic indicators is actually the stock market itself. And that makes sense from the perspective of markets being efficient. If markets are efficient, then these economic indicators shouldn't be able to predict the market. Instead, what happens is that the market sees like a recession coming in the future, and the market doesn't wait until that recession hits. The market reacts now, so the market is actually a leading economic indicator. Or if the market knows that economic activity is going to pick up in the future, then the market doesn't wait. The market actually goes up first in advance of that. So it turns out that instead of having economic indicators that help predict the market, it's more that the market helps predict the economy. Nevertheless, we'll try to pick up on some of these ideas and notions that maybe being able to determine even where we are in the middle of a business cycle might be helpful for investing. Okay, now I just wanted to show you a picture here. This is a big area. You can look into leading indicators for the economy. There's many of these. Some people really track all of them, but it's sort of a huge amount. There are also coincident indicators. These are the ones that are trying to tell you where you are right now in the business cycle, and there are lagging indicators which more confirm what has already happened. Okay, so again, this is a big area, and I've got a plot here just showing sort of the leading indicators and when they indicated things, how far in advance, coincident indicators, and then lagging indicators that are sort of confirmation. I'm going to jump over to FinViz and I'll show you where you can find some of these economic indicators if you're interested in this. So I'm on FinViz. I'm going to scroll down, and right in here, I'm going to click on one of these, and these are an economic calendar. And you can read through here. They tell you the day when something is being announced, and you can see that there's a whole bunch of them. Okay, so there's many. It can get very detailed. All right, again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I wanted to show you where you can track some of these if you were interested. Let's jump back to the slides. And I showed you that. These are often called an economic calendar. So not only at FinViz, but you can look at other financial websites to track a number of these. Okay, so we said the idea of actually using these indicators to predict the economy and then predict the market doesn't seem to work so well. And that's because the market tends to predict the economy more than the economy predicts the market. However, we can still use some of these ideas in industry analysis. So let's start talking about industry analysis. And now we're moving down from sort of countrywide analysis to different industries inside of the country. So let's dive into that. And the first topic that we're going to hit here is called sector rotation. This, I think, is a very, very nice idea. So we'll spend a little bit of time on it. So industry analysis. First, let's talk about, if you want to dive into different industries, what we're talking about here. Now, if you actually go to a financial website, and I'll show you in a second, it turns out you're going to find in general sectors, and there are 11 main sectors that they will break the market down into. And these are things like consumer defensive, cyclical. We'll actually talk about these words in a second. Utilities, real estate, different things, financial, healthcare, etc. Sectors tend to be the highest level breakdown. There's only 11 of them. And then you can actually more finely break it down. And that's when we're talking about industries, okay? And industries, there are a lot of industries, and there are different ways that you can classify them, okay? So depending on which website or which agency you go to, you're going to find different classifications of industries. I put a couple down here, but I'm going to show you quickly. Again, I'm going to jump to FinViz, and I'll show you where to find this. So let's jump over to FinViz. I'm going to go back to their main page, and I'm going to go right up to the top there, and there's groups. And I'm looking at groups, and I don't know if you can see this right above this. It says sector. So I'm looking at sector level, and again, they break it down into those 11 sectors that I mentioned. And they will show you the performance of every sector, and you will see that day to day, the sectors tend to perform differently, okay? They sort of have their own different nature. So, and they give you weekly performance and monthly and 3-month and things like that. So you can sort of break down the market into the different sectors and see how those are doing. So that's the highest level. Okay, and then I'm going to go down into industry. And when I go into industry, you're going to see there are very, very many of them. Okay, I don't know exactly how many FinViz uses. I don't know whose classification they use. But you see there's a number of those. So industry is much more fine classification. So that's what we're talking about here when we talk about industry analysis or even sector analysis. We're talking about breaking down the economy into these different silos, right? And then trying to understand what's going on in each of them. And they might be like the financial sector, healthcare, terms like cyclicals that'll come up in just a minute. Let's jump back to the slides. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we talk about the terminology sector rotation, or somebody mentions an industry, it's that classification. All right, let's talk about some ideas here. So here's the main idea behind what we call sector rotation. Okay, so that is one of the key terms that we're talking about here, an idea called sector rotation. And let's see what the idea is. So the idea is the following. Let's say we're at a certain state of the economy. Okay, maybe we're in expansion right now, and it's pretty clear that we're in expansion. And when we're in expansion, some sectors, some industries are going to do better than others, just because, and we'll talk about this in a second, because of the nature of their industry and the nature of their products. So here's a plot that shows which industries are doing well, and this is looking at their return on equity, looking at their investments and how much they're actually making on their investments. And we can see some are doing better than others at whatever time period this was. So computer systems is doing very well. They're making a lot of money on their equity. Others are not doing so well, heavy construction, money center banks. The question is, if you know you're in a state of the economy where you know that certain sectors are doing well and other sectors are doing poorly, does that translate into their stock price performance? Because that's what we can invest in. We can invest in their stock prices. Let's see if that happened in this case. So let's move over from their return on equity to see whether that translated into stock price performance. And we look at this, and they're ordered exactly the same here. And what do we see? Well, it's not a, absolutely 100% relationship there. But if you eyeball this, maybe you can see a slight line like that, maybe an okay fit. And it looks like there might be something to that, okay? So that gives us hope for this idea that, if I can identify where we are in the business cycle right now, then maybe that's going to help me pick industries that are doing well, that are well suited to this part of the business cycle, and maybe that will translate into good stock performance. That's the basic idea. Let's dive into that a little bit further. Okay, and here's sort of a picture of it. A key reason to consider different industries is that they respond differently to various periods in the business cycle. What we're going to see is that there are some industries that tend to do really well when the economy is going well and do really poorly when the economy is in recession. There are other industries that are much steadier, okay? So regardless of whether the economy is doing well or poorly, they tend to do okay. And that's the idea. So if we know those, then if we know that maybe a recession is coming or we're in a recession, what should we do? We should move to those industries that do okay, regardless of whether the economy is doing well or poorly. On the other hand, if it looks like we're coming out of a recession and we're beginning to go into expansion, then what would we do? We'd move our money into those industries that do really, really well when the economy is doing really, really well. So that's the idea. And that's called sector rotation. You are rotating your money into different sectors of the economy in order to match the business cycle. Let's see some ideas related to that. Okay, and we're going to get some terminology, and this terminology actually shows up in FinViz, right, under those different sectors. I'll show you that in a second. So here's some of the key terms. What we call a cyclical industry. This term right here is a very important one, a cyclical industry. Cyclical meaning cycle. So these are industries with above average sensitivity to the state of the economy. What does that mean? When the economy does well, they do really well. When the economy does poorly, they do really bad. Okay? And another way to think about that, okay, cyclical industries are often ones with a high beta. That just makes sense, right? Because if the market is doing well, generally the economy is doing well, and these are companies that do really, really well. And if the economy is doing poorly and maybe the market is going down, these are ones that do really, really poorly. So they tend to have high beta. What are some examples of these? One is a durable good. What is a durable good? A durable good is just something that's durable, that lasts. Okay, so if you have a product that lasts, let me give you an example, like a car. Okay, you've got a car. Cars tend to last for a while. And these tend to be very sensitive to the economy. Why? If the economy goes bad, and maybe you're worried about losing your job, or maybe you even get laid off, are you going to go out and buy a new car? No. Because that car lasts, you can hold off on that purchase. You're going to limp along with your old car, right, until the economy becomes better. On the other hand, when the economy is doing well, right, things are going great at your job, you think you're going to get a raise, or you do get a raise, you might be likely to go out and buy a new car. So in a good economy, they tend to do really well. In a bad economy, they tend to do really bad, okay? And we saw that just by the nature of the product. If a product is a durable good, if it's something that lasts, then in bad times, you're not going to go buy a new one. You're going to hold on to it because it can last. Okay, so that's the idea of a cyclical industry or a cyclical product. We'll dive into a little bit more what makes something cyclical or what makes an industry cyclical. But this is one example of a cyclical product. It would be a durable good. So that's a really important term, cyclical. On the other hand, we have defensive industries. What are defensive industries? These are industries with below average sensitivity to the state of the economy. And in general, this corresponds to a low beta. Okay, so think of cyclical, typically high beta, defensive, low beta. And what are defensive industries? These are ones like food, healthcare, utilities. If you think about these, what makes them defensive or what makes them not sensitive to the state of the economy? These are things that people have to buy just to survive. So regardless of whether the economy is good or bad, you will always be purchasing these. For example, food. You have to eat, even if you lose your job. If you lose your job, you're going to prioritize your spending so that you can still eat, right? Even if you lose your job, if you're sick, you're going to go to the doctor. You're going to try to keep the lights on. That's utilities. So if you think about products that in bad times, you're going to continue to buy anyway because you have to, those tend to be defensive products and related to defensive industries. All right, I want to show you that this terminology pops up in actually the definition of some of the sectors of the stock market. So let's jump over to FinViz again. Now I'm going to sectors. Let me make this a little bit larger. As I start going down the sectors, if you look at the second one there, it's called consumer cyclical. So right there, they're using the name cyclical. These are ones that are very sensitive to the business cycle. Another name you might see for this sector is consumer discretionary. Okay, and that's the idea that discretionary products tend to be more cyclical. As you keep going down, I've got financial, energy, basic materials, technology, industrials, and now I hit consumer defensive, and there you see the other term that we use. Defensives tend not to be that sensitive to the business cycle. These are sometimes called consumer staples. Why? Because the products are staples. They're products that everybody has to buy anyway. So that tends to be associated with this consumer defensive, or another name that you might see for consumer defensive would be consumer staples. Okay, just to go run through an example of these. Okay, so what kind of products would you expect to see in which one? And can we just visualize how sensitive these things are to the economy? So here, what do I have? I've got two different industries. I've got groceries and jewelry. Okay, so groceries we'd expect to be very what? Defensive. Why? Because you always have to go to the store. You always have to buy food. Let's look at their annual sales growth. That's in the red here, and you can see that it's pretty steady. Okay, it tends to be doesn't tend to go up or down that much. So that's why that tends to be a defensive industry. On the other hand, jewelry. Jewelry is one that's going to be a very discretionary purchase, so we'd expect that to be very cyclical. Why? Maybe somebody buys jewelry if they get a raise at work, or whatever, celebrating something. They have a lot of money. On the other hand, if the economy goes bad and you lose your job, are you going to go out and buy jewelry? No, you're not going to buy jewelry. So we can see the plot in blue. It really cycles a lot, goes up and down a lot, and it tends to go a lot with the economy. So that's an example, just by looking at the nature of the product, that you can see the distinction between cyclical and defensive. Okay. In general, what causes this sensitivity to the business cycle? What causes a company to be, or a sector to be cyclical versus defensive? So the first thing is just the nature of the product. That's what we just mentioned. That makes sense. Is it an essential product? If it's an essential product, like food or utilities, you got to keep the lights on, or healthcare, then it's going to be defensive. You're always going to buy it. It's not going to be that sensitive. If it's a discretionary purchase, that means you don't have to buy it. Then it's going to be more cyclical, right? So those are things that you're going to buy if you have the money, if you feel secure financially. So if it's a discretionary purchase, then it's going to be more cyclical, okay? And that's one of the main things that plays into whether a company or an industry is going to be cyclical versus defensive. By the way, sometimes a defensive is called a counter-cyclical, meaning it runs counter or against the business cycle. We're going to use the term defensive here. Okay, what are other things that would help determine whether a company is cyclical or defensive? Well, their operating leverage. Okay, what is their operating leverage? The ratio of variable to fixed costs. Okay. Why is that? Let's consider a company that their costs are mainly variable costs. Okay, what does that mean? Variable costs, they scale with how many items they're producing. Okay, so if there's a lot of variable costs, then if times are bad, they're not selling as much, what can they do? They can scale back their costs, and that means in bad times, they're able to control those costs and hopefully handle a downturn better, okay? So if they have variable costs, they can basically respond better to the business cycle, right? And that makes them defensive. So lots of variable costs tend to be defensive. Okay, on the other hand, if you run across a company that mainly has fixed costs, they're going to be very sensitive to the economy. Let's think about some examples of that. One that I think of is airlines. Okay, so when they fly an airplane from Los Angeles to New York, whether there's one person on the plane or whether the plane is full, the costs are roughly the same. So they've got a fixed cost for that flight. Now there are some variable costs, right? You know, maybe the number of snacks that they give people or something like that. But a lot of it are fixed costs. And so what does that mean? That means when the economy turns bad and when less people are flying, they're stuck with that full cost of flying from LA to New York, and they're probably going to lose money because they can't scale back that cost. Okay, so if they have high fixed costs, they tend to be what? Very cyclical. They're very sensitive to downturns. Okay, so operating leverage definitely relates to whether a company is cyclical or defensive. And the last one is financial leverage. Financial leverage is very similar to operating leverage. You look at the debt to equity ratio. Debt is a fixed cost, right? If they've issued lots of bonds, they've got to pay interest on those bonds. And even if the economy goes bad, they're still stuck paying that. So if they have a lot of debt, they're going to be cyclical as well. So high debt is a fixed cost, and that would tend to make them cyclical also. Okay, so these are some of the things. If you're looking at a company or you're looking at an industry, you can think of the nature of the product. You can also look at their operating leverage and their financial leverage to give you a sense of whether you expect them to be cyclical or defensive. Okay, this leads us to the main idea of how would I use this in trading? How would I use this to help me in my portfolio? And this is sector rotation. Sector rotation is shifting your portfolio into industry sectors expected to outperform based on macroeconomic forecasts. And so what is this? After a peak, the economy is peaking and you think the economy is about to turn down, so there might be a recession. What would you do? You'd move your money into defensive industries, right? You would sort of protect yourself. I'm going to go into things that people have to buy anyway. That should hold up okay even in a recession. All right, in a trough, then what are you going to do? Expansion is coming. You're going to want to go into things that are more cyclical. So it could be capital goods because companies see that the economy is going to begin to expand. They start to invest in those capital goods, things like that. In expansion, cyclical industries are often better. So this is a nice idea. Where do you think we are in the business cycle? Where do you think we're going? I'm going to shift and structure my portfolio to take advantage of that. If I think things are going great, the economy is going to boom, I'm going to move into cyclical industries. On the other hand, if I'm worried a recession is coming, I'm going to move into defensive industries. So if you look up this notion of sector rotation on the internet, you're going to see lots of different plots of basically telling you how you should rotate your money through different sectors in order to match the business cycle. And you're going to see plots like this. So let's take a look at this. If we're in contraction, that is recession, what is it? You want to be in defensive things. What are those? Sometimes called consumer staples. I believe in FinViz it was called consumer defensive. So even the name tells you, hey, that's defensive. Put your money in that. And other things that people always need, right? So people always need healthcare. They're going to go to the doctor. Utilities, they're going to try to keep the lights on and things like that. On the other side, if we're in full expansion, then what is that? That's things like consumer discretionary. That's another name for basically consumer cyclicals. I said if a purchase is discretionary, it's often a cyclical company. So that's another name for that. So that's consumer discretionary. Companies are building a lot then. The economy is booming. They're going to use a lot of materials, industrials. They're going to buy new plant and equipment and stuff like that. Okay, so you'll get different plots that sort of give you an idea of how you should shift your money depending on where you believe we are in the business cycle. So that's a very nice idea. It's a nice way to think about your portfolio and how your portfolio is structured relative to what you believe about the economy. And like I said, if you look at your portfolio right now and you say, hey, you know what, I think a recession is coming, you should probably be in more defensive industries. On the other hand, if you think everything's going great, I think the economy is going to boom, you should be in more cyclical industries. Okay, so very, very nice idea, this sector rotation. All right, I'm going to hit a couple of final ideas. I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. These are things that people would look at in industry analysis. Lots of these you might have touched on in other classes, so I'm going to go very quickly through them just to give you a sense of the idea that in investments we also care about these ideas. And that would be life cycle and industry analysis. So let's jump into these. And I'm going to give you a couple of ideas here that, like I said, you've probably seen in other courses. The first is to look at an industry life cycle. Okay, and if you're looking at any company, to ask yourself, where in the industry life cycle is that company? And this is the recognition that industries pass through different stages in their industry life cycle. Okay, what do those tend to be? Well, there's a startup stage in an industry. That is sort of a new product, new ideas. You see a lot of small startups, right, that are out there, and it would be high growth, very high growth. Then there's typically a consolidation stage. What is the consolidation stage? Some of those companies begin to merge, right? Leaders begin to show up, leaders begin to emerge. And then finally, it becomes a mature product, mature industry. It's reached its potential, and if you look at the industry, it's pretty stable. You got stable players in the industry, okay? And then eventually, every industry begins to decline, okay? And so you can see this depending on what product you're looking at. So for example, if I were looking at AI, AI is pretty new, right? So it's more in the startup stage. There are lots of new startups there, lots of potential new applications. So you expect rapid growth versus an industry that's been around forever, like, I don't know, something like soft drinks, where there's Coke and Pepsi, right? And so that one is at a maturity, and maybe at some point it'll actually go into relative decline. Okay, so understanding where a product is and where an industry is in this life cycle helps set your expectations. Don't expect for a lot of growth if you're investing in an industry that is at a maturity stage or relative decline. Okay, people often draw pictures of this. The pictures just correspond to what we said. And it's just setting your expectations. Initially rapid growth, right, eventually slowing, and lots of industries over some period of time, a new product will come in and take over, and they will actually go into decline. Okay, final thing I'm going to mention here that we also care about in investments, and this is sort of industry structure and industry placing. Okay, so industry structure and performance, and there are different frameworks that people use to look at this. And the one I'm going to mention is called Porter's 5 Forces. And this is also if you're looking at an industry and you want to invest in it, and you want to understand sort of the main players and the main influences on that industry. Porter said there are 5 things that you should look at. Okay, and the first 3 are the following: a threat of entry. Are there new entrants to the industry that could affect the industry? Okay, you always have to watch out for that. So threat of entry, what companies are well posed to move into your industry and disrupt it in some way. Rivalry between existing competitors, market share, competition pressures, price and profits. Who are the main competitors in the industry right now? Pressure from substitute products. Is there another product that could come in and take over and replace this product? Okay, so you want to think about all these things to understand where a company is positioned. Okay, 2 more of Porter's 5 forces. The last 2 here: bargaining power of buyers and bargaining power of suppliers. So look at a company. Who buys its product and who supplies it? And in a case like this, I always think of Apple, right? Because Apple dominates so much. And if you ever have look at trading a company that supplies Apple, Apple just totally dominates them. And what Apple can do some of the time is if Apple says, hey, we're not going to buy your product anymore, we're not going to have you be a supplier, it'll just crush that company. So it's good to understand from a sort of a holistic industry perspective to walk through these 5 categories and understand where a company sits relative to them. Okay, let's do a couple of problems here. Which one of the following firms would be described as having below average sensitivity to the state of the economy? A stalwart firm, a defensive firm, a cyclical firm, or an asset play? And the answer here is, of course, a defensive firm. That was our terminology for that. All right, if economic conditions are such that very slow growth is expected in the foreseeable future, one would want to invest in industries with blank sensitivity to economic conditions. Okay, so what sensitivity? Below average, average, above average, or since growth is expected to be slow, sensitivity to economic conditions is not an issue. And of course, the answer to this one would be below average. Okay, if you think the economy is not going to do that well, okay, you want to be in stocks that are not that sensitive to that. So you would want below average. And those we call what? Defensive. Defensive. All right, let's do one more problem here. Choose the one that you think would be more sensitive to the business cycle. Which one is going to be more cyclical? Okay, I'm going to give you some choices here. General autos or general pharmaceuticals? What is going to be more sensitive to the business cycle? Take a moment and think about that. The answer here would be autos, right? Pharmaceuticals are less discretionary purchase, right? Because pharmaceuticals are maybe you have some prescription, right, that you have to take for a medical condition, and whether the economy is good or bad, you're always going to buy that. On the other hand, if the economy is bad and you lose your job, you're not going to buy a new car. So autos are definitely more cyclical. Let's try another one here. Friendly airlines or happy cinemas. Okay, so it's basically airlines or the movie theater. Which one do you expect to be most sensitive to the economy? All right, so here's the answer. Friendly airlines travel is more sensitive to movies. Why is that? Travel, it's a bigger purchase. If you're going on vacation, that's much more of an expense than taking the family to the movies or something like that. So that one we would expect to be more sensitive or more cyclical. All right, that's it for chapter 12.